They laughed at the cowboy on the ridge. While the town prepared for winter the old way, he built something that looked useless, even foolish. A narrow tunnel of canvas and wood, crawling across frozen ground like a mistake no one could explain. They said he was wasting time. They said winter would break him first. But when the storm came, when the cold stole breath, when fires failed, when fear crept into every home, that useless tunnel became the difference between life and silence. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Silver Bend, Montana sat cupped in the shoulder of the Rockies like a town someone had forgotten to fold away after summer. From a distance it looked gentle, smoke threading from chimney pipes, a ribbon of road bending past pine and alder. But up close the place had teeth. The wind came first, sharp and metallic, carrying the smell of snow long before the flakes arrived. By late October, the daylight shortened as if someone were pinching the sun between gloved fingers, and the cold did not simply feel cold. It behaved like a presence that pressed into seams, searched for cracks, and made a person consider every hinge and nail as if their life depended on it. The sky often held a pale, washed-out blue by noon, and then slipped into bruised gray by afternoon. Even the dogs moved differently in that weather, trotting close to porches and keeping their tails tucked as if they knew the mountains were listening. Silas Crow lived on the ridge above town, far enough that the church bell reached him only as a faint, polite suggestion, and close enough that the river below still mattered. He was 33, a working cowboy by trade and a builder by necessity. He had the kind of face that looked carved rather than grown, high cheekbones, a long jaw, and a nose that had once been broken and never bothered to heal straight. A trimmed dark beard shadowed his mouth and chin, more out of habit than vanity, and his eyes were a weathered hazel, the sort that seemed to measure distance without moving. He wasn't tall in the way men bragged about, but he carried himself with a quiet solidity that made him look larger. Broad shoulders, lean waist, hands thick with callus, and small scars that told their stories without needing words. Folks in Silver Bend said he wasn't unfriendly exactly. He simply conserved speech the way he conserved matches. Years earlier, a winter had taken his father, lost in a whiteout between a corral and the main house, a short walk made, fatal by wind and pride. After that, Silas had learned a particular kind of patience, the patience that comes from watching nature win and deciding not to give it easy victories again. That morning the cold had arrived early, snapping the last yellow leaves from the aspens and skittering them like coins across hard ground. Silas stood in his yard with a coil of rope at his feet, a rough sketch in his head, and a length of oiled canvas folded over his forearm. His cabin was plain, built from dark logs and chinked with mud and straw, with a front door that opened outward and a small window that always seemed to collect frost around its corners. 10 steps from the door sat a low woodshed, and beyond it the slope fell away into pine and boulder. He could have stacked more firewood under the eaves like everyone else, could have patched the north wall where the wind worried the seams, could have spent the day doing what the season demanded in the usual way. Instead, he pounded the first stake into half-frozen soil and began laying out a line that ran from the cabin door to the woodshed, like a question asked in wood and cloth. The tunnel, as it would soon be called, did not look like anything a sensible man built for comfort. It was low enough that a grown man would have to stoop, and narrow, a sheltered corridor made from rough timber poles set in pairs and bent into shallow arches. Over those arches Silas stretched the oiled canvas, pulling it taut in places and loose in others, fastening it with knots that sat neat and stubborn against the wind. From the side, the thing resembled a long, pale serpent lying across the yard, its back rising and falling over the frames. It was not pretty. It was not meant to be. Silas worked without hurry, as if he were braiding time itself, and now and then he paused to watch how the wind slid along the slope, how it eddied behind the woodshed, how it lifted loose snow dust from last week's flurry and drove it into the corners where it would later become trouble. By mid-morning, the first rider appeared on the road below, then turned up the cut that led to Silas's place. It was Hank Lasker, a ranch hand from town, about 28 and built like a fence post, tall, straight, and narrow through the hips, with a sandy mustache that never quite decided whether it wanted to be serious. Hank's cheeks were red from cold and from the kind of laughter he liked to share with other men when no one was asking them to be wise. He swung down from his horse and leaned on the saddle horn, looking at the half-built corridor with bright curiosity that tipped quickly into amusement. "Well, I'll be," Hank said, his breath fogging out in a burst. "You building yourself a crawlway, Crow? Planning to start living like a badger?" Silas didn't stop tying the rope. He looped it, cinched it, and tested the tension with a tug. "Wind's coming," he said, as calmly as if he were reporting a horse had thrown a shoe. Hank laughed, a sharp sound that the cold stole and scattered. "Wind's always coming. Folks are stacking wood, fixing roofs. You out here sewing a coat for the yard." He walked closer, boot heels crunching frost, and tapped one of the poles. "Canvas like that ain't free." "It's cheaper than dying," Silas replied, not looking up. Hank opened his mouth as if to argue, then decided the effort wasn't worth the dignity. "You're something else," he said, and his grin softened into a kind of baffled fondness. "Town's gonna talk." "They already do," Silas said, and that was the end of the conversation as far as he was concerned. Hank mounted up and rode away, still shaking his head, leaving the yard to its quiet labor. The wind picked up around noon, worrying the loose ends of canvas like impatient fingers. Silas tightened another line and moved on. Later, when the sun sat low and thin behind cloud, a wagon climbed the ridge road, wheels creaking, and stopped at Silas's gate. The driver was Sarah Dunning, the woman who ran the supply store in Silver Bend. She was in her early 40s, with a steady posture that came from hauling crates and managing men who believed a woman should not be telling them what nails cost. She stood about average height, strong through the arms and shoulders, her build practical rather than soft. Her hair was chestnut brown with a few early strands of silver, braided and tucked beneath a wool cap. Her skin had the pale, wind-touched look of someone who spent most days near a doorway, half inside and half out, and her eyes were a clear gray that missed very little. Sarah was known for speaking plainly. Folks respected her because she never wasted a sentence and because the store was where everyone went when their own plans failed. She climbed down, pulled her coat closer, and studied the structure in Silas's yard without smiling. "I heard hammering," she said. "Figured either you were fixing something important or doing something stubborn." Silas wiped his hands on his pants and nodded once. "Both, maybe." Sarah walked the length of the half-finished tunnel, her boots leaving dark marks on the frost. She stopped near the cabin door and looked at the way the canvas would seal against the frame. "You're covering the path to the woodshed." "And the store of feed," Silas said. "And the water barrel once I extend it." Sarah's eyebrows lifted. "You planning to live underground?" Silas almost smiled, almost. "Just planning not to fight the wind every time I need something." Sarah crouched near one of the stakes, tested it with her gloved hand. "You'll need more rope," she said, "and heavier canvas if the storm tears at it." Silas nodded again, as if he had expected the advice. "I'll pay you next week." Sarah straightened, eyes narrowing slightly. "This isn't about payment." She glanced toward Tata, the valley, where the clouds thickened like wool being pulled across the sky. "People in town are nervous. They're pretending they're not, but they are. They keep saying winter's winter, like repeating it makes it smaller." She looked back at Silas. "You think it's going to be worse?" Silas's gaze stayed on the horizon. "I think it's going to be normal for the mountains," he said. "And that's bad enough." Sarah let out a breath that sounded half like a laugh and half like surrender. "You know what they'll call this," she said. "A waste, a spectacle, a man building a hallway for ghosts." Silas finally met her eyes. "Let them," he said. "If they laugh now, they'll remember later." Sarah studied him a moment longer, then nodded, the way a person nods when they can't prove you right, but can't shake the feeling you might be. "I'll leave a coil of rope at the store's back door," she said. "Take it when you pass through town." And Silas... She hesitated, and the hardness in her face softened. "Don't be too proud to ask for help when the weather turns." Silas's voice stayed quiet. "I'm not proud," he said. "I'm careful." Sarah climbed back into her wagon, flicked the reins, and rolled downhill, leaving behind the smell of horse and oiled wood. Silas returned to his work. He drove stakes until his arms warmed under his coat. He tied knots until his fingers ached. The tunnel lengthened, arch by arch, stretching from the cabin to the woodshed like a promise he had made to himself and intended to keep. As dusk arrived, the wind shifted. It came around the ridge in a new direction, colder, and carried with it a hush that was not peace, but warning. The pines below stopped whispering. Even the birds went quiet, as if the sky had told them something they did not want to repeat. Silas stood at the cabin door and looked down the valley where the last light bled away. Far off, the mountains wore a cap of cloud that seemed too heavy to be harmless. Behind him, the canvas tunnel shuddered gently, alive in the wind like a creature breathing. Silas rested a hand on the nearest pole, feeling the vibration travel through the wood, and in that touch was a kind of oath, part stubbornness, part tenderness, the way a man might lay a hand on a horse's neck before a long ride into uncertain weather. He could already hear tomorrow in the air, the first true howl, the first white wall, the first moment when laughter would freeze in someone's throat. He stepped inside, closed the door, and left the ridge to its gathering darkness, while the tunnel waited outside like a quiet idea that didn't care whether it was mocked, only whether it would hold. By nightfall, the ridge above Silver Bend felt narrower, as if the land itself were drawing its shoulders in against what was coming. The temperature dropped with an efficiency that left no room for doubt, and the wind changed character. Not louder yet, but sharper, probing. Silas Crow woke to that change the way some men wake to their names being spoken. He lay still on his narrow bed, listening to the cabin settle and creak, to the low complaint of the stove cooling, to the faintest rattle of canvas outside as the tunnel took its first real breath of weather. He rose without ceremony, pulled on his boots, and fed the stove until the iron sighed and glowed. This was not the storm yet. This was the mountain clearing its throat. Silas stepped outside through the front door and into the tunnel, ducking slightly as he had planned. The air inside was dim and close, smelling faintly of oiled cloth and raw wood, but it was calm. The wind slid over the curved back of the canvas with a hiss, finding no edge to seize. He ran a hand along one of the arches, feeling the vibration pass through it like a held note. At the far end, the woodshed door opened easily. The wood inside was dry, stacked with care, and when he carried an armful back through the tunnel, no snow followed him. That small victory mattered. Small victories were how winters were won. His horse, a dark bay gelding named Alder, stamped near the corral, uneasy. Alder was 9 years old, thick through the chest, with a white star at the center of his forehead, and a habit of rolling his eyes at strangers. He had been with Silas since he was a colt, bought cheap after a leg injury that never quite healed straight, but healed strong. Alder trusted routine and disliked surprises, which made him a fair mirror for his owner. Silas checked the latch, rubbed the horse's neck until the tension eased, and made a note to bring more hay down before morning. Alder snorted softly, accepting the promise as if it were a contract. Inside the cabin, the lamp cast a steady circle of light over the table where Silas laid out his supplies. He counted matches, inspected the edge of his knife, and took down the ledger his father had kept, its pages warped by old damp. There was a page near the back where the ink blurred, written after the winter that took him, and Silas did not read it tonight. He closed the book and slid it away. Memory was useful, but dwelling could turn it into a weight. In town, the wind worked differently. It threaded down streets and alleys, caught the corners of buildings, and made doors slam hard enough to rattle glass. The Lantern, a low, stubborn tavern that smelled of old smoke and spilled beer, filled earlier than usual. Men and women gathered not so much to drink as to confirm each other's presence. Sheriff Caleb Rhodes stood near the bar, tall and spare, his coat unbuttoned as if to show he wasn't afraid of the cold. He was in his early 50s, with iron gray hair. Cropped short and a mustache, he kept trimmed to regulation neatness. The years had put lines around his eyes that came from squinting into sun and snow, not from smiling. Caleb had lost his brother in a mining accident years back, and since then he had treated risk like a thing to be managed, not challenged. He listened more than he spoke, which made people fill the silence for him. "They say Crow's built himself a tunnel," someone said, a laugh skidding over the room. Like a worm. Caleb took a sip of coffee that had seen better days. Crow's not a fool, he said mildly. He's just early. That quieted the laughter a notch, though it didn't erase it. Hank Lasker was there too, leaning against a post, his bravado dimmer than it had been that morning. He rubbed his hands together and stared into his mug as if the answer to the weather might rise from the steam. Sarah Dunning stood behind the bar for a moment, delivering a crate of lamp oil, her eyes traveling the room with that measuring calm of hers. She caught Caleb's look and nodded once. Outside, the first snow began, not the dramatic kind, but a dry, needling fall that coated everything in a thin, deceitful white. It would be easy tomorrow to think this was nothing. On the ridge, Silas slept lightly. He dreamed of sound more than image, the long sigh of wind, the groan of timber, the canvas breathing like a living thing. Sometime after midnight, a gust struck hard enough to make the cabin shudder. Alder whinnied, sharp and brief. Silas was up and moving before the echo faded. He pulled on his coat, took the lantern, and went into the tunnel again. Snow rattled against the canvas like thrown grain. He crouched and inspected the stakes, pressed his weight against the arches, tightened a line where it had loosened. The work was physical and precise, and it steadied him. He could feel the mountain testing him, not with malice, but with indifference. By dawn, the storm had made itself known. The sky was a low ceiling of gray, and the snow fell heavier, thickening the world into something smaller. Silas moved supplies through the tunnel until his arms burned, extending the canvas another few feet to shelter the water barrel. He had anticipated this, had set the posts yesterday before the ground froze solid. When he finished, he stood in the dim corridor and let himself imagine the days ahead, the repetition, the careful conservation, the way routine could become a kind of mercy. Late that morning, a figure appeared at the edge of the ridge road, moving on foot with a stubborn set to his shoulders. It was Jonah Pike, a trapper who lived farther up the valley, a man in his late 30s with a beard that grew wild no matter how often he cut it, and eyes always scanning for signs. Jonah was lean to the point of looking unfinished, his cheekbones sharp, his clothes patched and repatched. He had learned caution young after a winter spent trapped in a line. Cabin with a broken ankle. Since then, he trusted no season and few people. He waved once, awkwardly, and made his way up. "Didn't think I'd see anyone out," Jonah said, voice hoarse with cold. "Road's turning mean." Silas nodded him into the tunnel without comment. Jonah ducked inside and stopped, surprise plain on his face. "Well," he said slowly, "that's clever." They stood in the filtered light, snow hissing overhead. Jonah explained he'd come down to check on his traps and heard talk in town of Silas's construction. Curiosity had beaten caution. He accepted a cup of coffee by the stove, hands wrapped around it like an offering. "People think winter is an event," Jonah said, staring into the cup, "like it happens and then it's over. They forget it's a process." Silas looked at the stove, at the steady flame. "Processes can be planned for," he said. Jonah left before noon, the storm tightening behind him. He paused at the tunnel's mouth and glanced back. "If this works," he said, "folks will want to know how." Silas shrugged. "If it works, they'll see." The snow fell all day. In town, doors froze shut, and men dug paths that filled again as soon as they turned away. The lantern stayed open, a pocket of light and talk, but the mood shifted from humor to calculation. Sheriff Rhodes organized patrols, knocking on doors, counting heads. He sent a boy up the ridge with a note for Silas, asking him to check in when he could. The boy never made it all the way. The wind turned him back, and the note came later by other means. As evening approached, Silas finished his last circuit of checks and sat at the table with a bowl of stew. He ate slowly, listening. The tunnel took the wind and gave back only a muted roar. Alder settled in the corral, hay close at hand. The cabin held its heat. Outside, the mountain continued its work, indifferent and thorough. Silas set his bowl aside and leaned back, letting himself feel the fatigue in his shoulders. This was only the beginning. He knew that. But beginnings mattered. They set the shape of what followed. He stood, banked the fire for the night, and went once more into the tunnel, lantern low, to make sure the world he had built between inside and out was still there. It was. The canvas breathed, the arches held. and for the first time since the sky had lowered itself over the ridge, Silas allowed himself a thin, private satisfaction, not of triumph, but of alignment, of having placed himself just barely in the right place against the season. By the third day, the storm stopped pretending it was temporary. The snow no longer fell in fits and starts. It arrived with intention, thick as ground grain poured from a careless hand. The wind hardened, losing its restless curiosity and settling into a steady, punishing direction that scraped heat from anything careless enough to face it. Silver Bend shrank under that pressure. Fences disappeared first, then the lower halves of doors, then the road itself, until the town felt less like a place and more like a series of isolated breaths held behind timber walls. Silas Crow woke before dawn, as he had since boyhood, but the darkness outside his window was different now. It pressed close, opaque, without the faint promise of morning. He rose, fed the stove, and listened, not just to the fire, but to the quality of silence around it. The tunnel muted the storm, but it did not erase it. Instead, it filtered the violence into a dull, manageable roar, like water behind a dam. That distinction mattered. Silas stepped into the tunnel, lantern swinging low, and moved through it with the ease of repetition. The ground beneath his boots remained firm and dry. No ice slicked the path, no snow followed him. He felt, not for the first time, a cautious gratitude toward the simple geometry of the thing. At the far end, the woodshed waited. He selected only what he needed, thick, seasoned pieces that rang faintly when knocked together, and carried them back. Conservation was a habit he had learned the hard way. As a younger man, he had burned wood like a challenge, as if the mountain were something to be proven wrong. His father's death had taught him otherwise. Winters did not respect bravado, they only noticed preparation. In town, preparation was beginning to show its absence. The first sign was smoke. Not the clean, steady plume of dry-burning stoves, but a low, dirty haze that clung to roofs and sagged into streets. Wet wood hissed and steamed, forcing stoves to labor just to boil away moisture before offering heat. Inside cabins, the air grew heavy and acrid. Children coughed. Windows wept condensation that froze along the frames. Men who had laughed at Silas's tunnel now stood outside in cutting wind, axes ringing uselessly against wood piles that had become single frozen masses. Hank Lasker was one of them. He hacked at his stack with more anger than sense. His sandy mustache rhymed with ice, his gloves stiff with frozen sweat. Each strike jarred his arms, sending pain up into his shoulders. When he finally pried loose a log, it came away slick and heavy, water locked inside it like a curse. He swore, breath tearing from his throat, and staggered back toward his door. Inside, the fire flared briefly, then died down into a sullen glow, the stove wasting its strength on steam instead of warmth. Hank's confidence began to rot in that moment, not loudly but thoroughly. Sheriff Caleb Rhodes moved through town wrapped in a thick coat, his face set in lines that came from calculation, not panic. He knocked on doors, checked on widows, counted children, and made notes he never intended to show anyone. His brother's death in the mine had taught him that disasters did not announce themselves all at once. They arrived in layers. He noticed the smoke, the coughs, the way people lingered longer in doorways as if afraid to return inside. He thought of Silas on the ridge and felt a tightening behind his ribs that had nothing to do with the cold. By midday, Sarah Dunning closed the supply store. There was no point pretending commerce could continue. She stacked what remained of the lamp oil and flour where it could be reached easily, her movements economical, her expression unreadable. She had always carried herself like someone who expected to be useful, even when usefulness came at a cost. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside, squinting into the white. The thought came unbidden, sharp and unwelcome. Crow might have been right. Up on the ridge, Silas extended the tunnel another few feet, angling it slightly to account for the way snow drifted against the shed. He worked steadily, the rhythm of the task keeping him warm. Partway through, he heard a new sound, lighter than the wind, irregular. He turned and saw a dog picking its way toward the yard, head low, tail cautious. The animal was a mixed breed, medium-sized, with a thick mottled coat of gray and black and one ear that never quite stood up. It looked to be 5 or 6 years old, lean but not starving, its ribs hinted rather than shown. One eye was clouded at the edge, the pale mark of an old injury. The dog paused at the mouth of the tunnel, unsure. Silas crouched, keeping his movements slow. "Come on," he said softly. The dog took a tentative step inside, then another, marveling, Silas suspected, at the sudden absence of wind. It shook itself, scattering fine snow that had clung to its fur, and padded closer. Silas offered a gloved hand. The dog sniffed, sneezed, and allowed the touch. "Lost or smart enough to follow shelter," Silas murmured. He brought the dog inside, dried it with a spare cloth, and set out a bowl of water and a heel of bread soaked in broth. The dog ate carefully at first, then with gratitude. Silas noted the way it kept one eye on the door, alert even while feeding. A survivor, then. He decided the dog could stay, at least for the duration. He named it Drift, for obvious reasons. That afternoon, the storm claimed its first quiet victory. Jonah Pike did not return to his line. He appeared instead at Silas's door, beard rimed with ice, one boot split at the sole. He looked smaller than before, as if the weather had shaved something essential from him. "Didn't think I'd make it back," Jonah admitted, voice stripped down to honesty. "Trapline's gone. Snow's buried it. Thought I'd freeze between here and the trees." Silas nodded and waved him in without comment. He gave Jonah dry socks, set him near the stove, and listened as the man warmed. Jonah spoke little, but what he said carried weight. He described drifts that erased landmarks, wind that knocked him sideways, the way the cold seeped through layers and began to negotiate with bone. "They'll start burning furniture soon," Jonah said finally. "They always do." Silas fed the fire and watched the flames take hold of dry wood with an eagerness that felt almost alive. "They'll learn," he said, not unkindly. As night fell, the storm intensified. The tunnel flexed and held. Drift curled near the stove, one ear flicking at unfamiliar sounds. Jonah slept in a chair, exhaustion overtaking caution. Silas sat at the table, mending a glove, his thoughts traveling down into the valley where the town huddled. He imagined doors frozen shut, hands numb around axes, children wrapped in every blanket their families owned. He did not feel triumph. He felt alignment, and with it, a growing responsibility he had not sought. Late that night, there was a knock at the tunnel's outer frame. 3 quick raps, almost lost in the wind. Silas moved fast, lantern in hand. Outside, bent against the storm, stood Sheriff Rhodes. His mustache was crusted with ice, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Road's closed," Caleb said without preamble. "We've got families running through wood twice as fast as planned. Wet stacks, bad air. I need to know if what you've built works the way it looks like it does." Silas considered the man for a long moment, the weight of years and choices passing between them. Then he stepped aside and gestured down the tunnel. "Come see," he said. Caleb ducked inside, straightened slowly, and let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to relief. He took in the dry ground, the absence of snow, the calm. "I'll tell them," Caleb said quietly. "Not to copy it tonight. They can't. But to understand what failed. Them." Silas nodded. Understanding lasts longer than panic. When Caleb left, the storm did not ease. But something else did. The distance between ridge and town shrank, not in miles, but in awareness. Silas banked the fire, checked the tunnel one last time, and lay down with Drift curled at his feet. Outside, the mountain continued its work, but inside, the system held. And for the first time since the valley had begun to choke on wet smoke, the idea of survival shifted, from individual stubbornness toward something that might eventually be shared. The 4th night arrived without ceremony, as if the storm had grown bored of announcing itself. Snow no longer needed to fall hard to be dangerous. It simply accumulated, patient and relentless, pressing weight into roofs and time into people's decisions. The valley lay muffled beneath it, sound swallowed, distance distorted. Lantern light in Silver Bend looked bruised and small, each glow a fragile island in a white sea. Up on the ridge, Silas Crow woke to Drift's low growl and knew something had changed. He rose quietly, easing his boots on, and listened. The wind had dropped for the first time since the storm began, not into calm, but into a heavy pause that carried sound far. Somewhere below, a door banged once and then did not bang again. That worried him more than the noise. He stepped into the tunnel, the lantern casting long, curved shadows along the canvas, and moved to the outer frame. Drift followed, hackles raised, one ear cocked toward the dark, at the edge of the yard. Three figures struggled uphill, moving with the stiff, uneven gait of people whose bodies had begun to ration heat. Silas recognized Sheriff Caleb Rhodes by his height and the squared set of his shoulders, even hunched against the cold. With him were two men from town. One was Eli Turner, a carpenter in his early 40s, broad-backed and thick-armed, his beard grown wild since the storm had cut him off from his routines. Eli had always been generous with his skill and careless with his planning, the sort who would help you frame a house in a day and forget to seal the seams before winter. The other was a stranger to the ridge, younger, slimmer, his coat too light for the conditions. His face was pale beneath a dusting of frost, eyes darting, jaw clenched as if holding words in place. Silas waved them into the tunnel without waiting for introductions. The men ducked inside, surprise loosening their tension as the wind fell away. Caleb straightened slowly, drawing in a deep breath, as if the air itself had shifted from enemy to ally. "This," Eli said, looking around, voice rough with exhaustion, "is something else." Silas nodded once and led them inside the cabin. The heat wrapped them immediately, and the younger man sagged onto a chair, hands shaking. Caleb shed his coat and hung it carefully, the habit of order asserting itself even now. "This is Thomas Reed," Caleb said, gesturing to the younger man. "Teacher, came west 2 years back, lives near the south edge of town." Thomas Reed looked to be about 30, with a narrow frame and ink-stained fingers that marked him as someone more accustomed to paper than labor. His hair was dark and unkempt, his face clean-shaven, cheeks hollowed by cold and worry. He had the look of a man who had believed preparation meant intellect alone, and who was now discovering the limits of that belief. "2 families near me ran out of dry wood," Thomas said, voice tight. "We've been sharing, but it's all wet now. The smoke—" He coughed, turned away, embarrassed. "Children aren't warming." Silas poured coffee, set bread near the stove, and listened. He did not interrupt, did not offer solutions yet. He had learned that panic needed to empty itself before it could accept direction. Caleb spoke next, his tone measured. "We're moving people into fewer houses, concentrating heat where we can, but that's a stopgap. The real problem is fuel. Wet wood is killing us slower than cold, but just as sure." He met Silas's eyes. "I need help that doesn't involve hauling half the town up here." Silas considered the fire, the steady burn of dry hickory. "You don't need tunnels tonight," he said finally. "You need dry wood tomorrow." Eli snorted softly. "And how do you propose we magic that out of snow?" Silas looked at him. "By changing how you store what you already have." They talked for an hour. Silas sketched with charcoal on the hot table, simple diagrams that showed wind patterns, drip lines, the way heat leaking from a wall turned snow into water and water into ice. He explained the idea of a buffer space, not a tunnel like his, but temporary windbreaks built from scrapboards, canvas, even stacked furniture, positioned to create a pocket of calmer air around wood piles. It wasn't perfect, it wouldn't save everyone, but it would slow the damage. Eli leaned over the drawings, brow furrowed. "We can rig that," he said slowly. "It'll look ugly as sin." Silas shrugged. "Winter doesn't care how things look." Thomas watched, eyes brightening as understanding replaced fear. "We can teach people this," he said. "Show them where they went wrong." Caleb nodded. "At first light." They left with a plan, and with something else that mattered more in the long run, permission to think differently. Silas watched them go through the tunnel, their shoulders less hunched than when they'd arrived. Drift followed them to the mouth and sat there until the darkness swallowed their shapes. The day that followed was one of motion. Silas loaded Alder with canvas, rope, and spare poles, the horse steady despite the unfamiliar work. He rode down into town for the first time since the storm had tightened its grip, following a narrow trench cut by earlier patrols. The town looked older somehow, as if the weather had aged it years in a week. Smoke hung low, clinging to buildings. Faces peered from windows with a mix of hope and suspicion. Eli Turner met him near the square, beard iced, eyes red but determined. Together with a handful of others, they moved from house to house, helping families rearrange wood piles, rigging crude windbreaks, teaching people to separate the driest pieces and protect them like currency. It was hard work, slow and unglamorous. More than once, someone scoffed at the idea, only to fall silent when a log split free and revealed itself soaked through. Sarah Dunning appeared midday, hauling a sled loaded with canvas she'd sacrificed from her store's stock. Her face was set, jaw firm, the look she wore when decisions had already been made. "You were right," she said to Silas, not with apology but with resolve. "Let's make that matter." Thomas Reed moved among the houses, explaining, demonstrating, his voice gaining strength as he saw results. Children followed him, curious, their laughter tentative but real. Sheriff Rhodes coordinated, his calm presence keeping tempers from flaring when resources ran thin. The storm did not stop, but the town adapted around it, awkwardly at first, then with growing competence. By evening, Silas returned to the ridge, muscles aching, mind sharp. He fed Alder, checked the tunnel, and sat by the stove with Drift's head heavy on his boot. The dog slept deeply now, trust earned. Outside, the wind picked up again, testing the new arrangements below. Silas knew some would fail. He also knew some would hold. That was enough for tonight. He lay down, exhaustion settling in his bones, and listened to the storm through layers of canvas, wood, and intention. The valley had not been saved, not yet, but it had asked the right question at last, not how to fight winter, but how to endure it. And that question, once asked, had a way of changing everything. The storm did not loosen its grip after the valley learned to adapt. If anything, it grew more exacting, as if offended by the sudden competence of the people beneath it. Temperatures plunged another 10 degrees, and the snow that fell now was finer, drier, the kind that slipped through any opening that had not been carefully considered. It found its way into cuffs, into hinges, into the smallest failures of imagination. In Silver Bend, the air sharpened until breath itself felt like a task to be completed rather than an instinct. Silas Crow felt the change before dawn, the way he always did. The stove required more careful feeding now, not more fuel but better timing. He woke, listened, and adjusted. Drift lifted his head from the floor, gray-black fur catching the firelight, one good eye clear and watchful. The dog had changed in the past days, losing the skittish edge of a stray and gaining the steady alertness of something that belonged somewhere. Silas scratched behind the pea, loose ear and rose, pulling on his coat. Outside, the tunnel held, but just barely. Snow had banked high against its windward side, pressing the canvas inward, altering the airflow in subtle ways Silas did not like. He moved slowly along its length, lantern swinging, checking knots and stakes. At one arch near the middle, a pole had begun to twist under the uneven pressure. Not a failure yet, but a warning. He marked it in his mind and braced it with a spare length of timber, wedging it tight. The tunnel settled, its breathing evening out again. Alder stamped in the corral, steam rising from his nostrils. The horse's dark bay coat had dulled under the constant cold, but his eyes were bright, his posture steady. Silas fed him extra hay and lingered a moment, forehead resting against the warm curve of the animal's neck. Horses understood endurance in a way few people did. They did not imagine an end. They simply continued. By mid-morning, trouble announced itself not with noise, but with absence. The smoke over town thinned too much. That was never a good sign. Silas saddled Alder and rode down, Drift trotting alongside, paws sinking soundlessly into the drifts. The trenches cut through town had deepened, walls rising on either side like frozen waves. Faces appeared as he passed, older now, eyes set deeper, movement slower. He found the problem near the southern edge, where Thomas Reed lived. A small house crouched there, its windows rimed white from the inside. The door stood open, heat bleeding out into the cold. Inside, the air was thick and sour. A woman sat on a chair near the stove, wrapped in a blanket, her face gray with exhaustion. She was Margaret Hale, a seamstress in her late 30s, slight of build, with hair once auburn now dulled by smoke. Her hands shook in her lap, fingers reddened and cracked. On the bed lay her son, no more than 7, his breathing shallow, cheeks flushed in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. Thomas stood. Nearby, coat off, sleeves rolled, his ink-stained fingers useless now. Panic had sharpened his features, making him look younger and older at once. "The wood," he said when he saw Silas. "We did what you showed us, but it wasn't enough. It's all gone damp again." Silas knelt by the stove, listening to the fire. It hissed weakly, fighting itself. He touched the child's forehead, then Margaret's wrist, counting the pulse with a steadiness that surprised Thomas. We need hotter heat, Silas said. Not more flame, better flame. He sent Thomas running to Eli Turner's shop, where Eli had been breaking down old beams salvaged from a collapsed shed. When Thomas returned with a bundle of dense, resin-rich pine, Silas split it fine, stacked it carefully, and rebuilt the fire layer by layer. The change was gradual, but unmistakable. The stove began to radiate, not just glow. The air dried. Margaret's breathing eased. The boy stirred, coughed, and settled. Silas did not linger. He left instructions: vent the room, dry the kindling near the stove, rotate the wood constantly, and moved on. The storm was claiming ground in smaller, more intimate ways now, and he felt the weight of each decision press closer. Near the square, Sheriff Rhodes coordinated a group clearing snow from roofs, preventing collapse. He looked older than he had a week ago, lines etched deeper, but his movements remained precise. When he saw Silas, he nodded once, a gesture of trust rather than greeting. "We lost Mrs. Calder last night," he said quietly. "Not to cold. Smoke." His jaw tightened. "We're learning too slow." Silas absorbed the words without comment. Loss was a language Winter spoke fluently. He could not argue with it. He could only answer where possible. As the day wore on, a new figure appeared in town, drawn by rumor or desperation. Her name was Abigail Moore, a widow in her early 50s who lived on the outskirts beyond the river. She was tall, gaunt, her back slightly bent from years of lifting water and carrying grief. Her hair, once black, had gone iron gray, pulled into a severe knot beneath her scarf. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, shaped by a life that had taught her to expect little help and accept none lightly. She arrived with a sled piled high with split wood, dry wood, wrapped carefully in canvas and rope. "I heard you know how to keep it that way," she said to Silas, her voice rough but steady. "Figured it was time to trade." Silas studied the sled, the care evident in its packing. "What do you want?" "Knowledge," Abigail said. "And maybe a favor later." He showed her what he could in the time they had, how to build a simple lean-to with a gap for air, how to lift wood off the ground, how to think about wind as a shape rather than a force. She listened without interruption, nodding once when she understood. Before she left, she pressed a bundle of dried venison into his hands. "For the dog," she said, glancing at Drift. The dog wagged his tail once, solemnly. Night came early again, as it had learned to do. Silas returned to the ridge with muscles aching and thoughts heavy. The tunnel greeted him with its familiar dim calm, though the braced arch creaked in protest. Inside, Jonah Pike was waiting, sitting near the stove, his beard trimmed shorter now, his posture less defensive. "I've been thinking," Jonah said, "about the line, about staying." He met Silas's eyes. "I can help. I know how to read weather, and I owe you." Silas considered him. The ridge could use another pair of hands, another set of eyes. "Stay," he said simply. They ate in companionable silence, Drift gnawing the venison with quiet focus. Outside, the storm continued its work, but it no longer felt singular. It felt distributed, answered in small ways across the valley. Before sleep, Silas walked the tunnel one last time, lantern low. He touched the canvas, the wood, the earth beneath. He thought of Mrs. Calder, of the boy's flushed cheeks, of Abigail's sled. The storm was still taking. It always would. But it was also revealing. Who prepared, who learned, who shared, and who waited too long. He extinguished the lantern and lay down, Drift warm against his legs, Jonah's breathing steady nearby. The system held. For tonight, that would have to be enough. Winter settled into its most dangerous phase, not when the storm was loudest, but when it became ordinary. The valley learned the sound of constant wind the way a person learns the ticking of a clock, by eventually forgetting to notice it. Snow no longer inspired fear, it inspired fatigue. Days blurred into one another, marked only by how often fires needed tending and how quickly hands went numb once gloves came off. This was the season's true test, not the violence of arrival, but the endurance of continuation. Up on the ridge, Silas Crow marked time differently. Each morning began with the same circuit: stove, tunnel, woodshed, corral. Drift followed at his heel now without hesitation, his mottled coat thickening, his once clouded eye clearer since regular meals and warmth. The dog had developed the habit of pausing at the tunnel's mouth, sniffing the air, then stepping inside with visible relief, as if acknowledging the invisible boundary between danger and design. Alder remained steady, his breath a soft thunder in the cold, his patience unwavering even as the drifts rose higher along the fence line. Jonah Pike proved himself useful in ways Silas had not expected. Where Silas observed structure, Jonah read patterns. He could sense subtle shifts in weather hours before they arrived, his body remembering the pain of that long-ago winter injury. He had the lean, weathered look of a man shaped by solitude, sharp nose, close-set eyes, beard now neatly trimmed, but his manner had softened since staying on the ridge. Shared purpose had sanded down his suspicion. Each night, he and Silas talked little, but when they did, it mattered. "Storm's turning again," Jonah said one evening, standing near the tunnel, head tilted like a listening animal. "Not colder. Heavier." He was right. 2 days later, the snow returned with weight, thick flakes piling faster than before. Roofs groaned under it. In town, the makeshift systems people had built were tested again, not by moisture this time, but by sheer accumulation. Silas rode down with Jonah at his side, drift loping along, and found Sheriff Rhodes already organizing crews to clear rooftops. Caleb Rhodes looked worn now. The lines around his eyes had deepened, his mustache flecked with gray ice that never fully melted. Yet his voice remained steady, carrying authority not from force, but from consistency. "We'll lose buildings if we don't stay ahead of this," he said, handing out instructions with practiced economy. "No one works alone. If you feel dizzy, you stop." Among the volunteers was a new face, Samuel Ortiz, a blacksmith in his late 30s who had arrived in Silver Bend the previous spring. He was broad-chested, thick through the arms, his forearms corded with muscle earned at the anvil. His beard was dense and dark, trimmed square, and his hands bore old burns and scars that spoke of heat endured willingly. Samuel had lost his forge roof in the first week of the storm and rebuilt it himself, salvaging iron and timber with grim determination. Where others complained, he simply worked, his presence lending weight and confidence to the group. Silas climbed onto the roof of the lantern alongside Samuel, shoveling snow into the street below. The work was brutal and monotonous, but necessary. As they labored, Samuel spoke quietly. "Back home," he said, meaning Arizona, "winter was something you waited out. Here it feels like something you negotiate with." Silas nodded. "Winter doesn't listen," he said, "but it responds." That afternoon brought a different kind of crisis. A runner arrived from beyond the river, one of Abigail Moore's neighbors, breathless and panicked. The river ice had shifted, cracked under its own pressure, cutting off access to several outlying homes. One man had tried to cross and fallen through, pulled out alive but half frozen. Silas did not hesitate. He gathered rope, canvas, and poles, and rowed out with Jonah and Samuel. Abigail met them at the edge of the river, her tall frame rigid with contained fear. The ice groaned beneath their feet, a low, unsettling sound. Silas assessed the flow, the stress lines, and made a quick decision. They would not cross. They would adapt. Using the same principles as the tunnel, buffering, redirection, controlled exposure, they rigged a temporary sheltered line along the bank, allowing supplies to be moved without stepping onto unstable ice. It was slow, exhausting work. Hands went numb, ropes froze stiff. But by nightfall, food and dry wood reached the stranded homes. Abigail watched Silas secure the final line, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "You don't rush," she said, "even when time matters." "That's when rushing does the most damage," Silas replied. The rescued man, later identified as Peter Lang, a farmhand barely 20, face still boyish beneath a thin beard, was wrapped in blankets near a tent. Fire, color slowly returning to his cheeks. He stared at Silas with something like awe, not gratitude. "I thought I was done," he said simply. "So did Winter," Jonah muttered. "Turns out it was wrong." That night, back on the ridge, Silas felt the strain finally reach his bones. He sat by the stove, hands aching, Drift's head heavy on his knee, Jonah asleep nearby. The tunnel creaked under fresh snow load but held. The braced arch from days earlier remained solid, a reminder that foresight paid interest. Yet even here, danger crept in quieter forms. Silas noticed his remaining food stores shrinking faster than planned, not wasteful, but shared. More mouths had come to depend on what he could provide, directly or indirectly. He recalculated by firelight, adjusting portions, planning contingencies. Survival, he knew, was not a single solution, but a series of revisions. The next morning brought a rare gift, a break in the clouds. Pale sunlight spilled across the valley, harsh and beautiful, revealing the full scale of winter's work. Snow lay deep and sculpted, roofs bowed, trees bent, and yet smoke rose more cleanly now. Systems, imperfect, improvised, were functioning. Silas rode down one last time that week, checking on the offer of help he had set in motion. He found Thomas Reed teaching a small group how to restack wood under windbreaks, his confidence earned. He found Sarah Dunning distributing supplies with calm authority, her store transformed into a coordination point rather than a shop. He found Samuel Ortiz reinforcing stoves, welding cracked iron by lantern light. What he did not find was laughter. People no longer joked about foolish tunnels or wasted canvas. They spoke instead of airflow, of dryness, of preparation. The language of survival had changed. That evening, Silas returned to the ridge and stood at the tunnel's entrance, watching the valley in the fading light. The storm was not over. Weeks of winter still waited ahead. But something fundamental had shifted. The valley was no longer reacting blindly. It was learning. Silas ducked into the tunnel, drift close behind, Jonah already inside. The canvas rustled, familiar now, almost comforting. He closed the cabin door, bent the stove, and let the fire settle into a steady, efficient burn. Winter remained vast and indifferent, but it was no longer uncontested. The danger that followed was not announced by wind or weight. It arrived instead as a thinning, subtle at first, then unmistakable, of margins people had assumed were wide enough. Food bins no longer felt full when lifted. Barrels sounded hollow when struck. Even conversation grew spare, trimmed of anything that cost energy. The storm still ruled the valley, but it was no longer the loudest presence. Hunger, measured and patient, had begun to take notes. Silas Crow felt it in the arithmetic of his days. The ledger he kept by the stove now required erasures, recalculations made with charcoal rubbed thin by use. He had planned for a long winter, not for the winter to expand into other people's lives the way it had. Sharing had been necessary, right even. But necessity did not refill shelves. He adjusted portions again, reduced his own first, then found there was little left to cut without consequence. Drift sensed the shift too, lifting his head when bowls were smaller, tail, wagging less often, though he never complained. Alder grew leaner through the ribs, still strong but requiring more hay than Silas liked to admit. Jonah noticed it all and said nothing, which in its way was a kindness. In town, Sheriff Caleb Rhodes called a meeting in the Lantern, the first in weeks that gathered more than immediate neighbors. The room was cold despite the fire, breath fogging in uneven bursts. Faces looked older, sharper, the skin around eyes pulled tight by sleeplessness. Sarah Dunning stood near the bar, arms crossed, her posture straight, as if spine alone could hold the room together. Samuel Ortiz leaned against a beam, shoulders squared, expression set. Thomas Reed sat with a notebook open, pen poised, though there was little left to write that had not already been written in people's bodies. "We need to know what we have," Caleb said, voice steady, pitched low to conserve strength, "and what we don't." They spoke carefully, counting sacks of flour, barrels of beans, the last jars of preserved fruit. The numbers did not argue, they only pointed. The valley could make it through another month if distribution was strict and fair. Another storm like the last would shorten that margin dangerously. No one said it aloud, but everyone heard it. Fairness would feel like loss to those who had more. A murmur moved through the room. Not anger yet. Apprehension. Silas stood near the back, hat in his hands, listening. When he spoke, the room stilled, not because he raised his voice, but because people had learned to measure the distance between his words. "There's food beyond the valley," he said. "North, past the cut, old supply caches, abandoned lines. It won't be easy, it won't be fast, but it's there." Eyes turned toward him, some hopeful, some skeptical. The northern cut was treacherous even in summer, a narrow pass that collected snow like a debt. Crossing it in winter bordered on reckless. Caleb studied Silas for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Who goes?" he asked. "I will," Silas said. "Jonah, and one more who knows the iron." Samuel Ortiz pushed off the beam before anyone else could speak. "I'm in," he said. "I've worked cold steel my whole life. I can work this." The choice was made quickly, the way necessary things often are. They would leave at first light, travel light, carry rope, canvas, tools. They would take Alder and Samuel's mule, a stubborn gray named Mercy with a scarred flank and a reputation for stopping only when she decided the ground was worth standing on. Drift would stay behind, guarding the ridge and Jonah's gear. The dog watched the preparations with solemn attention, as if understanding the stakes without grasping the details. Before dawn, Silas stood at the tunnel's mouth, checking knots one last time. He rested a hand on the canvas, felt the familiar steadiness. The tunnel had been built to protect movement between known points. This journey would test what lay beyond that logic. Jonah adjusted his pack, beard rimed with frost, eyes alert. Samuel checked his tools, hands sure, jaw set with the quiet resolve of a man who had rebuilt himself once already after losing a forge, a roof, and nearly his livelihood. The northern cut greeted them with indifference. Snow lay deep, sculpted into hard ridges by wind. Progress was slow and exacting. They took turns breaking trail, breathing measured, movements deliberate. When the wind rose, they used the canvas as a moving shield, anchoring it briefly to create pockets of calmer air where they could rest. The principles held, even here. That knowledge mattered. By midday, the sky dimmed and the temperature fell another notch. Samuel's mule balked at a narrow ledge, hooves skidding. Jonah spoke softly, steadying her, while Silas set a line and redirected their path a few yards at a time. It took an hour to gain 20 feet. No one complained. Complaints. Wasted heat. They reached the cache by late afternoon, a low structure half buried in snow, its door warped but intact. Inside they found what they had hoped for and more. Sacks of grain sealed in oilcloth, crates of dried legumes, tins of lard stacked neatly by some careful hand years before. The smell of old wood and iron filled the space, comforting in its solidity. They did not linger. Stormlight faded fast, and the cut did not forgive late decisions. They loaded what they could carry without risking return, lashed everything tight, and turned back as the sky bruised toward evening. The storm caught them halfway. Wind rose, snow thickened, visibility collapsed into a narrow tunnel of white. Ironic, Silas thought, the world reduced to the shape he understood best. They anchored the canvas, huddled close, waited out the worst of it. Samuel sang under his breath, a low rhythm from his childhood, words in Spanish shaped to breath and cold. It steadied Mercy. It steadied Jonah, too. They reached the ridge well after dark, exhausted but upright. Drift met them at the tunnel, barking once, then pressing close, tail wagging with restrained relief. Silas led them inside, heat wrapping them, and for the first time in weeks, he let himself sit without immediately counting what it cost. The return changed the valley, not in abundance, but in posture. Food was distributed with care, but also with a measure of grace that had been missing. People ate a little better. Children slept longer. Fires burned steadier. The knowledge that effort could still produce results mattered as much as the calories. A new face appeared during distribution, a quiet woman named Lila Brooks, a nurse in her early 30s who had arrived the previous summer and found herself stranded by the storm. She was of medium height, dark hair pulled back tightly, eyes calm and observant. She moved through the lines, checking hands for frostbite, listening to coughs, offering small, precise interventions. She thanked Silas once, simply, and returned to her work. On the ridge, Silas adjusted again. The tunnel required new bracing after the journey's strain, and Jonah helped, hands quick, understanding deepening between them. Drift resumed his watch, content. Alder ate well that night, sides filling out just enough to reassure. When Silas finally lay down, fatigue deep as the snow outside, he thought of the cache, of the old hands that had packed it for a future they would not see. Survival, he realized, was a relay. You carried what you could, passed it on, trusted that someone ahead had done the same. Outside, winter pressed on. Inside, the system held, not because it was perfect, but because it was shared. Winter did not end with drama. It loosened its hold the way an old man releases a grip, slowly, reluctantly, testing whether it might yet be needed. The first sign was not warmth, but sound. One morning, Silas Crow woke to water moving somewhere beyond the tunnel, a faint, unfamiliar trickle that threaded through the silence like a rumor. He lay still, listening, hardly daring to believe it. Drift lifted his head, ears twitching, then rose and padded toward the tunnel with cautious curiosity. Outside, the world was changing its language. The snow still lay deep across the ridge, but it had begun to sag, losing the sharp authority it once held. The wind softened, no longer cutting but nudging, as if uncertain of its role. Sunlight, pale and tentative, touched the canvas of the tunnel and lingered instead of sliding away. Silas stepped inside that familiar corridor, lantern unlit for the first time in weeks, and felt damp earth beneath his boots. Not ice, not powder, but soil, remembering itself. He exhaled slowly. This was the dangerous part now. Thaw could undo what cold had not. Down in the valley, Silver Bend stirred like a creature waking from fever. Roofs dripped steadily, water carving channels through snowbanks. Children emerged first, drawn by novelty, their laughter cautious but real. Adults followed more slowly, wary of what the melt might reveal. Sheriff Caleb Rhodes organized crews again, this time not to fight cold but to manage water, clearing channels, reinforcing foundations, preventing the river from claiming more ground than it was owed. Silas rode down with Jonah and Samuel, Alder's hooves sinking deep into the softened drifts. The town looked battered but standing. Chimneys leaned, fences listed, but homes remained. Smoke rose cleanly now, not from desperation but habit. The systems they had built during winter's worst weeks adapted once more, shifting to meet the new threat. Knowledge had not frozen with the snow. It had settled into people. At the square, Sarah Dunning directed supplies with the same calm authority she had shown all winter, though her hair had more silver in it now, her eyes deeper set. She caught sight of Silas and smiled, not wide, not dramatic, but with the satisfaction of someone who had seen planning justify itself. "We're counting damage," she said, "not bodies." That mattered. Near the river, Abigail Moore supervised the reinforcement of the temporary banks they had built during the storm. She moved with the confidence of someone who trusted her own judgment more than hope. When Silas approached, she nodded once. "Your ideas held," she said. "So did ours." It was as close to praise as she ever came. Thomas Reed worked nearby with a group of older children, teaching them how to redirect meltwater away from foundations using simple trenches and boards. His face had filled out, confidence sitting more comfortably on him now. Lila Brooks moved among the workers, checking hands, reminding people to rest. She paused when she saw Silas. "You kept them alive long enough for spring to matter," she said quietly. Silas shook his head. "They did that themselves." The real reckoning came a week later, when the snow retreated enough to expose the full measure of winter's work. Some houses were lost, collapsed under weight or rot revealed by thaw. Mrs. Calder's home stood empty, its door swinging open in the warmer wind. People gathered there one afternoon, not to mourn loudly, but to mark the place. Winter had taken its due, it always did. But it had not taken the valley. On the ridge, Silas began dismantling the tunnel. He worked slowly, carefully, folding the canvas as if it were something alive that deserved respect. Jonah helped, his movements practiced now, the ease between them earned. Drift lay nearby, watching with mild confusion, occasionally trotting through the diminishing corridor as if to test whether it still existed. When the last pole came down, the ground beneath was revealed, dry, packed hard, untouched by rot. It looked like proof. Silas stacked the canvas neatly in the shed, each fold deliberate. He knew he would use it again. Winter was not something you outgrew. The town climbed the ridge one afternoon, not all at once, but in small groups. They came to see what remained of the madman's tunnel. What they found instead was Silas sitting on his porch, mending tack, Alder grazing nearby, Drift asleep in the sun. He looked thinner than he had in autumn, beard longer, eyes deeper, but strong, settled, not triumphant, just present. Hank Lasker stood awkwardly at the edge of the yard, hat in hand, sandy mustache trimmed again. "I laughed," he said, voice rough. "I was wrong." Silas looked up, considered him, and nodded. Winter teaches fast, he said, if you listen. Sheriff Rhodes stepped forward next, posture easier than it had been in months. We're planning ahead, he said. Next year, storage, shelter, routes. We'd like your help. Silas glanced toward the folded canvas, then back at the people who had once mocked him, now measuring distances from door to shed, imagining what might be built. I'll help, he said. But you'll build your own. They stayed a while, asking questions, making notes, not treating him like a hero, but like a man who had seen something early and refused to ignore it. That felt right. Spring advanced unevenly. Mud replaced snow, then grass pushed through, stubborn and green. The river settled back into its banks, chastened. Fences were rebuilt, roofs repaired. Children played without counting minutes in the cold. Silver Bend did not emerge unchanged. It emerged wiser. One evening, Silas rode out alone to the edge of the ridge, Drift running ahead, Jonah busy below. He looked out over the valley, now streaked with brown and green, the scars of winter visible but healing. He thought of his father, lost in a storm that had taught him nothing because it had ended too soon. He thought of the tunnel, of canvas and poles and a willingness to look foolish. He smiled, just slightly. Winter had tested them all. Some had learned, some had paid, but the valley endured. Silas turned back toward home as the sun dipped low, the light warm on his face. Drift bounded toward him, tail high. Alder lifted his head and snorted softly. Life resumed, not as it had been, but as it needed to be. And when the first cold wind of the next autumn eventually came, it would find a valley no longer laughing at preparation, but quietly building what it knew would save it. As the snow melted and the valley breathed again, people called it luck. Some called it preparation. But those who truly lived through it knew something deeper had been at work. Because sometimes God does not arrive as thunder or fire. Sometimes he comes quietly, as an idea no one understands, as patience when the world is rushing, as the courage to build something useful even while being laughed at. That tunnel was never just canvas and wood. It was faith made visible. Faith that whispers, prepare, even when no one believes you. Faith that protects not only the one who builds it, but everyone who learns from it later. In our own lives, we face storms too. Illness, loneliness, fear, loss, and often the miracles we pray for do not look miraculous at first. They look small. They look foolish. They look like quiet choices made in love when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may be facing a winter of their own. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. And if you believe that kindness, preparation, and faith still have a place in this world, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories that heal. May God bless you and your family. May He keep you warm in your hardest seasons. And may He remind you that even in the coldest moments, you are never forgotten.